So we're going to continue with our discussion of switch configuration, and we're going to talk about the initial configuration dialog. Now, the initial configuration dialog is what comes up on a router or switch whenever it is booted and does not have a configuration in the flash. In our case, we're back here on our 2960, and I've reloaded it. You'll recall that we didn't put a configuration on it earlier. And so after it reloads and it goes through all of its self-test, if we scroll up through the scroll back buffer here, you can see where it reloaded it, and it loaded the iOS, gave us the copyright information, checked the file system, checked all the hardware, gave us the serial number and the model number, so on and so forth. And it finally comes down to this: would you like to enter the initial configuration dialog? We're just going to step through this dialog, and you'll see some of the items that you can configure here with this dialog. If you hit no, then it just exits directly to the user exec prompt. And we've already seen that a little bit. So we'll just enter yes here. We'll hit Y for yes. And you'll notice that we still have the question mark available to us, and we can also see what the default value is because it's in brackets. So first it prompts us for basic management setup. Basic management setup pretty much configures an IP address on the VLAN 1 interface, and every switch port by default is in the VLAN 1 VLAN. And so that means if this switch is connected to your network on any of its physical ports, then you should be able to get to this guy using this IP address, assuming you can actually route to that address. So yes, we're going to go through basic management setup. The first thing we want to do is configure the global parameters. In this case, we want to enter a host name. It defaults to switch because that's its default name. In this case, we'll name it C2960_lab. And hit enter. It now asks for the enable secret. You'll recall when we talked about the command line interface in the previous videos, when we went into enable mode, we typed EN for enable and hit enter, that it just went directly into enable mode. And that is because we did not have an enable secret set. It's always a good idea to set an enable secret. Otherwise, anyone that guesses a username and password for your switch will have full configuration access into your switch. That enable secret is just one more level of security. In this case, we'll make the enable secret enable. You'll notice that it does echo it out to the screen so that you can actually see what you're entering. So our enable secret is enable. And it also prompts you for the enable password. The real difference between the enable secret and the enable password is that some of the older iOS images use the enable password. Essentially, it's just a different method of encrypting the password. The enable password uses a reversible encryption. The enable secret does not. In this case, we'll make the enable password and the enable secret the same thing. That's always a good idea just from a sanity standpoint. So we'll do enable for that guy as well. And actually in this version, it makes you specify a different enable password, so we'll do enable 1. Next, we're prompted for the virtual terminal password. The VTY password is the telnet password, or the SSH password. This is a password that's required before you can even get user exec privileges on the switch. Again, it's always a good idea to set this, and in fact, if you don't set a VTY password, you cannot actually telnet into the switch. It just tells you, quite literally, when you connect, telnet password required but none set. In this case, we'll make our terminal password the word password, super secret. And next, we're prompted if we want to configure SNMP network management. We won't go into SNMP network management in this video because it's a lot of settings that we don't really need to get into quite yet. Obviously, the default is no. If you choose yes, then you're prompted for the read and write community strings and perhaps an access list, depending upon the version of the iOS you're using. In this case, we'll hit enter and say no. Here's our current interface summary. All 48 of our ports and our 4 gigabit ports. Now you'll notice that it asks you the interface name to be connected to the management network from the above summary. Now you can specify a single interface, like Fast Ethernet 040 for example, and it will assign the management address to Fast Ethernet 040 and only that one interface. While this may work well in some situations, generally it's a good idea to assign the management connection to VLAN 1. This way, any interface that's in VLAN 1, and again, by default, it is every interface on the switch, can be used to connect to it for management access. In this case, we'll tell it VLAN 1, configuring interface VLAN 1, configure IP on this interface. The default is no. We'll tell it yes because we actually do want to configure IP on this guy. The IP address for this interface, we'll give it 10.10.10.1. Subnet mask, it defaults to the Class A subnet mask since 10. Is a Class A network. In this case, we'll make it a Class C network. And again, we're asked if we want to enable as a cluster command switch. And again, cluster commands are actually a little outside the scope of the CCENT, so we're just going to say no at this point. And then it tells us what configuration file has been created, and it gives us a chance to look through this file for any obvious errors. In this case, interface VLAN 1 is not shut down. There's its IP address. There's our enable secret and our enable password. We go all the way down through here. It's not configured anything interface specific. And now we're given the options. The last time we can back out of this, we can tell it to go to the iOS command prompt without saving the configuration. This way, if you wanted to specify some interface specific configurations, you could do so. You could just throw out all of your changes or save the config to NVRAM and exit. In this case, we'll choose the default, which is number 2. Builds the configuration and dumps us right out to user exec. Now, if we enable, and our enable password is enable, and we do a directory on the flash, we can actually see that our configuration is there. There's our config.txt. And no, it's not really 13 minutes after midnight on March 1st, 1993. That's just the default time for the switch since we have not specified a time server. But that covers the initial configuration dialog, and that brings us to the end of this video.